Okay, the title of this lecture is Survivor on Parole in Hawaii. This is part one. We're going to describe a study of actual parolees in Hawaii. And if you have not done so, what I would like you to do is push pause, go to the website you see, and print out the source that you see. I'm going to do several lectures on this source. You should definitely print it out and read it and use it as a reference for yourself. I also want to just let you know that I'm feeling a little bit sick, so I may be coughing and sniffling, and I apologize. And I also, since when you record these online lectures, you have to talk continuously, so I occasionally have to take a sip of water to keep my throat from going dry, so please excuse that. All right, let's go to the next slide. I want you to recall that in crude terms, there are two basic types of community corrections: probation and parole. If a person is sentenced to probation, they are not incarcerated or locked up, but they live in the community under a set of restrictions or conditions of their probation sentence. Okay, basically, be a good little citizen, don't commit any more crimes, meet with your probation officer, etc. Parole, on the other hand, is essentially early release from prison. Okay, you were let out into the community under a set of restrictions. If you follow them, you never have to go back to prison again. Okay, if you mess up, you can be sent back to prison to serve more time. So essentially, you have to be a good little boy or girl in prison, and then you become. They may grant you parole in prison if you do, if you follow the rules essentially, and they let you out early. The goal of this lecture is to provide a general description of or a general demographic description of people on parole in Hawaii. Essentially, who are they? Okay. This source is 1999, and I apologize if it seems dated, but it is essentially the most publicly up-to-date academic publication about parolees in Hawaii. So from that standpoint, I think that it's good for us to look at it in this class. There are certainly more up-to-date studies from other states about parolees, I would guess, but Hawaii's a unique place, so I think it's worthwhile to look at this. Just really quickly, part 2 of the lecture will provide a general description of success and failure of these parolees. It's another part of the study. And then parts 3 and 4 will examine the factors that contribute to the success and failure, essentially, of people on parole in greater detail. Next slide. Okay, why should we care about parole? Why even bother with it, essentially? Why should we let felons out of prison early? Why not just lock them up and throw away the key? Let them rot in prison for their entire sentence, and then let them out on the streets. Why shouldn't we just do that? I think these are good questions. They're worthwhile questions, at least, to ask. One reason to care about parole is that both nationally in America and in the state of Hawaii, we embarked on an immense incarceration binge starting in the 1980s. Okay, just to give you an example, from 1992 to 1997, Hawaii's imprisonment rate alone rose 76%. So that's in a span of about 5 years. We almost doubled our prison population. And in 1996-97, we had the largest percentage increase in prison population in the whole nation. If you look at those numbers, our actual, 3,800 people in prison is not large, but we're a small state. So, in essence, Hawaii and indeed the nation, we are spending more and more of our public resources locking people up. Okay, locking people up, incarceration is expensive to the taxpayers. It's about $20,000 to $40,000 a year. On average, about $30,000 here in Hawaii. In fact, Hawaii's prison population is so large that we can't house them all in state. And as you see by this graphic in front of you, this table, we send a good number of them out of state to serve their prison sentences in prisons in other states of the nation. So according to the Associated Press, which was in the Star Bulletin, February 20th, 2006, Hawaii houses about half of its 3,800 inmates in other states in private prisons run by this private corporation. It's called Corrections Corporation of America, CCA. You might have heard about it, even by stock in it, etc. This corporation So essentially in Hawaii, we create more prisoners than we can house. So we spend a considerable amount of money locking people up. Okay, and it's about $110 a day when we lock them up in Hawaii, and about $56 a day when we send them out of state. So if you do the math, which I did for you, I just kind of used the numbers there from the article to figure out how much we're spending. Excuse me. Okay, so essentially, if you look at it, the total cost is we're spending $116 million a year. That's $116 million a year. That's 1/10 of $1 billion. That's a lot of money. If you were to assume no growth in prisoners or inflation, which is not realistic, you could say that we will spend over $1 billion incarcerating people in prison over the next 10 years. That is a lot of money. Okay, that's not chump change. If you ask me, $116 million. I'm sorry that I don't have the cost of parole per inmate per day for you. I couldn't find that information, but if we did, we could say, okay, here's how much it costs to lock someone up, and here's how much it costs to have them on parole. I just, commonsensically, it's a lot cheaper to have somebody out on parole because you're not paying for 3 hots and a cot. You're not paying for 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, having people in cages. You have to buy their toilet paper, their food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So commonsensically, parole would save us a lot more money than incarcerations. And even though this is a lot of money, it's probably an underestimate. These numbers probably don't include the construction costs of the current prisons, even though we may or may not have paid for them. And they probably don't include the transportation costs to and from other states. I'm not sure if they do. They may or they may not. But this may, in fact, be an underestimate. I don't know that for sure. But this is at least how much we're spending just incarcerating people. This doesn't include people on parole. This doesn't include people on probation. This is just the people we lock up. So that's a serious chunk of change from our state budget. In the next slide, we're going to look at some other reasons why we should. Okay. Another reason we should care about parole is because virtually all the inmates will leave prison one day. Okay? Only those people who are sentenced to life without the possibility of parole will stay in prison forever. Okay? That, trust me, I don't have the figures, but it's a very, 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 very small percentage of all the people we send to prison. So almost every single person who's in prison right now will get out of prison one day. Okay, so if we have them on parole, which is early release, why not have them on a short leash, okay, on parole, than simply setting them free without any conditions? Thus, it's sort of in the public's financial and safety interests, if you will, to have an idea of who does well or poorly on parole and why. It's cheaper to have people on parole, and it should make good common sense to have them out on a tight leash when they first leave prison. Sort of asking them, can you handle freedom? Because if not, we have you on a short leash and we can put you back into prison for not following rules. We don't have to just catch you committing a new crime. So in essence, it's sort of a test period for people who've been in prison. And since most people are going to get out of prison, it makes sense to me, at least, to let them out a little bit early and have them on a tight leash. But just so you know, the essential public policy or theoretical rationale for parole. It saves the taxpayers money, and done correctly, and they do take steps to minimize the risk to the public. As you'll see as this study goes on, actually, I was quite surprised that basically parolees aren't out there committing as many dangerous crimes as I once thought in Hawaii. Okay, let's do a quick review of how parole works in Hawaii. The lecture, Parole in Hawaii, explained the bureaucratic organization of the parole system in Hawaii in much greater detail, but a quick summary is warranted here. Okay, if an offender is sentenced to prison by judge, they were convicted of a felony. Okay. Then a non-judicial body called the Hawaii Paroling Authority, or the HPA, determines the minimum sentence. This minimum sentence is the date that a prisoner becomes eligible for parole. Okay. They exercise supervision over the released prisoner, and an offender may be on parole in the community for a period of time and then discharged, or they may be found in violation of the condition of their parole, and then they would be subject to being returned to prison. So essentially, the Hawaii Paroling Authority performs all of these functions for the parole system in Hawaii. Again, that other lecture gives you much more detail about exactly what they do, but essentially they make all of these important decisions. How you get on parole. Okay, essentially, you get on parole when the HPA meets and decides to grant you parole with something called a release plan that is, sort of tailored to your individual needs. Inmates at this stage are assessed using a number of factors on their risk for reoffending, need for treatment, training, etc. And then next, a recommended plan is developed, and the inmate is assigned to a particular parole officer, sometimes called a PO. Have you ever heard of that? Most parolees go into what's called in Hawaii called community supervision, which is regular or generic parole. There are special parole programs such as mental health, intensive supervision, but we described those in the earlier lecture. But while under community supervision, which is the basic kind of parole, essentially for the first 6 months they have to meet with their PO about 2 times a month, and then they're subject to 2 forms of what they call alternative contact. Typically it's a phone call and a field visit. Assuming the parole does well after the first 6 months, that amount of contact is reduced to 1 meeting and 1 phone alternative contact a month. But the PO has discretion to modify this to meet, as they view it appropriate to the needs of the particular person on parole. That's essentially how you get on parole in Hawaii, and most people end up in community supervision. Okay, this study had 3 primary goals. This part of the lecture, we're going to do essentially goal number 1, which tracked a group of parolees while they were on parole. So the 3 goals are that it attempted to describe the characteristics of a cohort of prisoners released from prison from July 1st, 1995 through June 30th, 1996, and they tracked them through June 1998. So they took a whole group and tracked them. Then they determined what proportion of this cohort or group survive or continue without being revoked or absconding. Revoked means they sent you back to prison, they took away your parole. Absconding means you run away. And the proportion who are returned to custody for another period of incarceration before again being released. And then lastly, it estimated the factors that contribute to the probability of revocation or survival on parole, and these will be covered in the next lectures in this series. Okay, in this lecture we're going to be primarily concerned with goal number 1. Who are the people on parole in Hawaii? What are their characteristics? Okay, before I get into goal number 1, I want to give you a little forward or an intro. Essentially, cohort is just a fancy name for a group. Okay, if you graduated in 1999, you could think of you and your classmates as a cohort. Okay, we could follow your cohort and study you guys in some way. So essentially this study can only describe the characteristics of a cohort of prisoners released from July 1st, 1995 through June 30th, 1996 and tracked for another 2 years. Okay? But it's not a sample, it's actual population data, and that's a good thing. To follow a whole cohort. In case you don't understand statistics, samples, and etc., it's better to have population data if you can, because then you don't have to get into error estimates. However, I do want you to know that parole cohorts can differ over time. The type of parolees released differ over time depending on how the criminal law is written and policed in any state or in any particular time. Just so you know, prior to 1913, all the things that you think of as illegal drugs were entirely legal to consume. So it's just in the last primarily 20 years that we became really concerned about drugs and started writing laws with stiff sentences for drugs. So since the 1980s, Hawaii and other states have been focusing their criminal justice resources on drug offenses. So we'd expect a lot of drug offenders in this cohort than, say, if the study were done in the early 1960s when Hawaii and other states were less concerned about people using drugs. In the future, we'll be concerned with a new kind of criminal, and we will focus more on that type of crime, and then studies of prisoners in that era will reflect that new focus. Okay, so for example, from the mid-1980s to September 11, 2001, for sure, at least the federal criminal justice system was composed primarily of drug offenders due to the war on drugs. But I bet that as time goes on, our federal criminal justice system might be more focused on terrorism. And if they catch enough terrorists, sorry about that, if they do catch enough terrorists and convict them, the federal prison system would fill up with those types of offenders. So in that case, then if we were to follow a cohort of parolees from the federal system in the future, it might have a whole bunch of terrorists in it. Okay, so essentially what you need to know is that criminal laws are socially constructed. They're made by legislatures, so how they're made and written and then policed is important. So the people who come out of prison, early, which are parolees, are going to reflect that social construction. Give you a perfect example. Chicken fights are illegal in Hawaii. I don't know if there's a felony for chicken fighting, but essentially we don't police them very. Let's pretend, just for argument's sake, that it was a felony. Okay, but we don't police them very much. Okay, so it's not only how the law is written, but what do we seek to police? That will determine who goes into prison. So it's a long way of saying that the people in this cohort reflect their historical circumstances of the times when we were primarily concerned about drug offenders in Hawaii and in the nation. Okay, let's describe Hawaii's parolees. Who are the characteristics? First of all, most of the people sent to prison nationally in Hawaii are men. Remember, you have to go to prison before you end up on parole. So there were 604 people in the cohort. 92% of them were men. Remember that the HPA, the Hawaii Paroling Authority, sets the minimum and maximum term for imprisonment. So a person is eligible parole. Now, only eligible after they've served their minimum amount of prison. So you have to serve your minimum sentence, and then you become eligible. That doesn't mean that you're going to be granted right away. But just so you know, and I'll show you a table of this next, of those granted parole, they serve about 4 years on a 3 to 10 year sentence. But these times are actually underestimates of the actual time served, and I'll explain that below. But as a group, for those granted parole during the study period, remember, this is a time where our prison system was bursting at the seams, where we're having to send more and more people out of state because we don't have enough room in our prisons in Hawaii. People who were granted parole were sentenced to about 3 to 10 years and served about 4 years before they were granted early release on parole. Obviously, the length of sentence they were given, minimum, maximum, depends on the type of crime they were convicted, property crime, etc. Violent crimes typically get the longest sentences, etc. Okay. So as a group, which includes everybody, so this is going to underestimate it too, we can't look at individuals, they serve all of their minimum sentence, okay, and about a third of their maximum sentence as a group. Okay, in this slide what you see is average minimum and maximums per type of crime committed. So you have violent crimes, property crimes, drug crimes, etc. Essentially, as you can see here, violent crimes tend to get the longest sentences, which sort of makes sense to you. And then on the bottom you see all offenses, how much time they served. Actually, these figures underestimate the total time served by people in these offense categories for two reasons. Number one, this doesn't reflect the average minimum and maximum for everybody who's sentenced to a violent offense. These are only the people who were eligible for parole. So if you think about it, it's only the best behaved violent offenders who were granted parole. So of these people who were granted parole and who had violent offenses, their average maximum term was about 12 years. Their minimum term was about 4.8 years, and they actually served about 6.1 years before they were released. Okay, so that's just the best behaved ones. The second reason that it's actually an underestimate proportion of the minimum to the maximum is that this is just the first time they're released on parole. Many of these people were released. They ended up basically messing up on parole for a variety of reasons. Either they committed a new crime. Most of them you'll see didn't. But they didn't follow the rules of parole, and so they were sent back to prison to serve more time. So essentially what happened for the study cohort is the actual time served is a little bit higher here. It was about 41.8% of the minimum. That's much higher than you see here on this table, and that's because some of them mess up and get sent back to prison. You should also know that these average minimums and maximums differed by offenses, by type of offense. That should sort of make sense because we give people more time in prison for what we deem more serious offenses. That's the way our laws are written. We deem violent offenses, for example, murder, you should get more time than if you steal a car stereo. That's the way we kind of write our laws, so that's why these different offense types have different amounts of time that they were served for minimum maximums and how much time they actually served. So these are underestimates for two reasons. Number one, they don't reflect all violent offenders or all property offenders or all drug offenders because these are only the best behaved ones who were granted parole. So if you screw up in prison, you're not a good little boy in prison, you're not going to be granted parole in the first place. Secondly, of the people who are good little boys and are granted parole, a lot of them mess up and get sent back to prison. So these are actually underestimates, if you will. So in plain English, these do not reflect the average time served for all violent offenders, property offenders, drug offenders, etc. in Hawaii. They're underestimates. Okay, not everyone eligible for parole is let out on parole because some people mess up, and some people, when they get out on parole, they mess up and they get sent back to do more time. Okay, so these are underestimates, if you will. Okay. Here's the age of first conviction by gender for this parole cohort. You can see that basically crime is a young man's game here. The vast majority of people we put in prison are male. I think earlier we said it was something like 92%. This is first conviction. This is not necessarily the conviction for which they were granted parole, but as you can see, a lot of them are sentenced to their first conviction when they're quite young. Interestingly, so if you kind of look at this table, about 75% of the men were committed had their first conviction before age 24. And as further evidence, as a group, about more than half of the parolees' age of first conviction was as a juvenile. So that's sort of a statement about institutionalization. Basically, a lot of these people started off at crime very little. It's kind of one of the double-edged swords of putting people in prison or locking them up and putting them in cages. Essentially, when you put people in cages, they kind of start to act like animals, and it's a much different environment as it is out on the street. And they'll essentially sort of kind of get used to it. And then when you let them out on the streets, they don't know how to act. So it's kind of a statement about institutionalization that people. It's just a danger of, there are good times to send people to prison and there are bad times, but a lot of these people who were sentenced to prison when they were very, very, very young. I shouldn't say very, very young, excuse me, that's juveniles. Let's go to the next slide and you can see some. Okay, here you can see that essentially violent crime is a man's game compared to women. 32% of the males were originally sentenced. This is actually for this parole now. 32% of the men were sentenced for a violent crime as opposed to only 10% of the females. You can see the difference there. Females tend to do more property and drugs than males. But even that, males are doing about 53% of property and drug. So it's just sort of a statement about the difference between men and women and what types of crimes they tend to commit. And this is this group of parolees, the cohort. Just so you know, there's that little asterisk there is a definition of violent crimes. Property crime is essentially, they don't say exactly in the report, but essentially it's, if you steal things from people. A drug crime is what we call a non-violent drug crime. Either you're caught in possession or you're caught dealing or trafficking in some way. Because if you were to steal money to get drugs, assuming you didn't rob somebody, that's what's called a property offense. So if I stole your car stereo to get drugs, I would be included in the property, not the drug offense, because we deem that as more serious. If I hurt somebody because I was high, I would be included in the violent offense category. So those drug offenders are just people who do so-called non-violent offenses, non-violent drug offenses, either possession or dealing. Okay, so if they were caught stealing or hurting people, they'd be in the other categories. As you can see by this slide, a lot of the people in this study were deemed by the correction system of Hawaii to have life disruption from drugs. This is essentially a clinical decision that's made by, it doesn't say in the report exactly, but it's made by people in the correction system in Hawaii. So essentially only 10% of the males and 17% of the females were judged to have no life disruption from their drug use. About 70% of the group as a whole, more males than females, but essentially if you look at the total, about 70%, that's more than 2/3 of the people were said to have serious life disruption due to their drug use. If you add that to the some life disruption, over 90% of people who were sent out on parole had at least some life disruption, and most of them had serious life disruption from drug use. So it's sort of, as you'll see later, you'll see this thread of drug use and drug problems running through these people who are let out on parole. Essentially, you're putting a lot of people in prison who have drug use, and as you'll see, that drug use tends to keep them going back to prison. And I'll make some comments about that in later lectures. I think it's kind of crazy to stick people in a cage for using drugs when you can get any drug you want in that cage. But aside from that commentary, there are a lot of descriptive statistics in the report if you're interested. I just sort of gave you the main ones. So this was just a description of who were let out on parole for this cohort and what for sort of their demographic description, how many were male, what percentage are female, etc. Alrighty.